Hello again, it's your friendly neighborhood historian here, back with another video. And it's going to be a long one, I think. So sit back, relax, and get ready for some knowledge to be dropped. In this episode, I'll be covering the build-up to World War I, the war, and the immediate post-war, along with the Russian Revolution. Let's start with the build-up to World War I, naturally. With Bismarck's alliance system. His main goal in doing this was to prevent Germany from being sucked into a two-front war because fighting on two separate fronts is really detrimental to overall military strength. So he pursued an alliance system to A. Isolate France due to them hating Germany after Germany whipped their behinds in the Franco-Prussian War of 1871, and B. To secure Germany's position in the center of the continent so that they can gain strength. They did this first by bringing Austria-Hungary and Russia together in the Three Emperors League, but it quickly dissolved due to rebellion in the Slavic territories of the Ottoman Empire, as Austria-Hungary and Russia sparred over who can have control over the Balkan nations. I have a skit of them sparring.
No.
Emperor Franz Joseph,
Tsar Alexander?
we meet here in Bulgaria to contest over the influence of the Balkan nations.
Yes, Bulgaria is our rightful ally, and Serbia and Romania belong to the Austrian Empire, yeah.
But this region is Slavic. As the protector of the Slavic people, we have the right to come in and intervene when some outside force threatens our brothers in arms.
Well, I guess we must fight then, yeah?
Yeah, we do.
Bismarck then formed an alliance with Italy and Austria-Hungary, but true to Italy during this time, they signed a separate defensive deal with France, essentially having a hand in both sides of the upcoming war. Bismarck then negotiated a separate alliance with Austria-Hungary in 1879, and that formed the basis of the Central Powers in World War I. 2 years later, Bismarck renegotiated the Three Emperors League, but true to Austria-Hungary and Russian interests in the Balkans, the league was severed when the Bulgarian crisis fired, leaving Russia separate from Germany and Austria-Hungary. This gave way to the nickname of the Balkans during this time period of the powder keg of Europe, meaning that if something were to happen in the Balkan region, it would set off an explosion that would take all of Europe down with it. The other side of the war was, of course, the Entente. The Entente first comprised of France and Russia, who were united against Germany and the Central Powers. Britain was dragged into the Entente by German aggression, but more on that, well, now. Kaiser Wilhelm I died in 1888, and a new Kaiser had to be chosen. His son, Frederick III, ruled for only a few short months before succumbing to cancer, leaving Kaiser, or King, Wilhelm II to rule over Germany until the end of World War I. Wilhelm was a sort of new ruler, one that contrasted with Bismarck's views and tendencies. So as such, in March of 1890, Wilhelm fired Bismarck and set about implementing his own policies, which tended to antagonize the rest of Europe. First, and this is in no chronological order, Wilhelm instituted a massive naval buildup for the German Navy, or Kriegsmarine, if you want to be true to the German language. This made Britain, let's say, less than happy. This was one step in a growing arms race pre-World War I. Better, more deadly guns were developed, and countries used the love of country and nationalism to rally the people behind the cause of fighting for king and country. This was harder in empires such as Austria-Hungary or Russia because of their multinationalism. Austria-Hungary was an empire in decline, though, so the inability to muster any unity was damning. The region was deeply fractured by growing nationalism in territories like Bohemia, or, the modern-day Czech Republic, the former and new Yugoslavian territories, and Transylvania, or part of modern-day Romania. In addition to that, the empire didn't industrialize as much as Germany or France, so the nation lacked all of the benefits of the Industrial Revolution. But in other countries, such as Germany, men were easy to come by. Citizens of Germany, France, and Britain were compelled by their respective governments to take up arms and fight for their country. French people were motivated to retake Alsace-Lorraine from the Germans. Germany was built on Prussian militarism, and serving in the army was seen as honorable and righteous. Moving on, Britain had been growing wary of Germany's increasing power in the center of Europe and saw the buildup of the Kriegsmarine as an active threat to their empire. Britain at this time, along with France and Germany, had vast overseas empires, with Britain's being the largest. Britain's and France's empires had become a source of envy for Germany and Russia as they wanted to expand their overseas possessions and gain more wealth from around the world. This tension was slightly averted by the Berlin Conference of 1884, which sought to divide up Africa as to not cause any conflict. Britain and France got the largest slices of the pie, with other powers like Italy and Germany only gaining meager holdings. Thus, France and Britain needed a large navy as a police force for that empire, so if Germany were to build up their navy, they could be seen as a threat. Next up in Germany's antagonizing tour was the First Moroccan Crisis. I'll sum it up real quick. Kaiser Wilhelm just wanted to engage in a hint of tomfoolery. He went to Morocco to support the Sultan of Morocco in order to provoke the British and the French. He didn't have any vested interest in Morocco, though. It was just to disrupt the alliance, which didn't really happen. Finally, Wilhelm authorized the building of the Berlin-Baghdad Railway in order to access a port on the Persian Gulf, perhaps to challenge the British in the Middle East. No. They could never. But that's just what the British thought. Unfortunately for the Germans, the railway was never completed, and furthermore, Baghdad was captured by the British during the war, and other sections of the railway was attacked by Lawrence of Arabia, but I'll get to that. The railway went through Ottoman territory, and the empire had been in decline for some time now. The Ottomans failed to industrialize as much as the West, and as such were technologically and economically behind. Industrial nations were able to produce more guns, artillery, equipment, etc. than other non-industrialized nations. Couple that with the population boom that accompanied the Industrial Revolution, the Ottoman Empire just didn't reap the benefits of industrialization. Along with a series of military failures all over Europe, such as their loss of Greece in 1830 and the loss of Romania, Serbia, and Bulgaria in 1878, and it started to look like the Ottomans were getting pushed out of Europe. Before World War I, there were two Balkan Wars, in which the Ottomans lost much of their remaining territory in Europe. For now, though, the Kaiser had done everything that Bismarck had tried so hard to avoid. He'd handed France an ally in Russia, and as such, had split the German forces between East and West. In allying to the declining Austro-Hungarian Empire and the sick man of Europe in the Ottomans, Germany ensured themselves weak allies. All of this tension that I mentioned came to a head on July 28, 1914. The heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, Archduke Franz Ferdinand, was assassinated by a Serbian nationalist by the name of Gavrilo Princip in Sarajevo. Austria was understandably furious that their heir to the throne was just assassinated, so Austria-Hungary issued an ultimatum to Serbia, which Serbia rejected. Austria-Hungary had the backing of Germany through the sending of a blank check, which promised Germany's unconditional support for any Austro-Hungarian aggression. Serbia appealed to Russia, who was still allied to France, who was friendly with Britain, so the battle lines were drawn. The war started on July 28th with Austria-Hungary invading Serbia, and soon after the remaining major powers had joined the war. On to some military strategy, which I quite enjoy. Germany's plan hinged on a major element of warfare that wasn't exactly present in World War I: speed. The Schlieffenplan, devised by German Field Marshal Albert von Schlieffen, hinged on the German army coming through Belgium and hitting the French line like a door, as seen by this visual here. But one small issue with this plan: Belgium was neutral, and invading it would certainly drag the UK into the war. But Germany wanted to take France out of the war as quickly as possible so that they could focus their resources on the Eastern Front against Russia. On August 4th, Germany entered Belgium and captured the fortress city of Liège in 11 days. From here on, I'll be pointing out the most important battles of the Western Front in order and then focusing on the East. Germany wasn't able to blitz through Belgium and France quickly enough to avoid French and British reinforcements, so the Central Powers and Entente were locked in a stalemate in mid-September, and the two sides engaged in a race to the sea in an attempt to flank one another. This was also unsuccessful, noticing a trend, so the two sides constructed trenches from Switzerland to the Atlantic, and trenches served as the grisly backdrop for all the battles in the Western Front. I don't think I myself can sum up just how gruesome trench warfare was. Your life was sitting in a trench for 2 weeks at a time, dealing with artillery fire that likely killed soldiers more than any other method of killing. Disease and rats were rampant in the trenches, and the imminent threat of enemy snipers lurked at every corner. And if that wasn't bad enough, commanders would call for over-the-top charges, which were mainly suicidal attacks into prepared defenses, like machine gun nests or artillery fire. The first major battle on the Western Front was the Battle of the Marne, a river in France in which the Allies halted the German advance into the French mainland. This is one of the only major battles that didn't take place in the trenches, unlike the battles of Ypres or Verdun. The next battle was the aforementioned Ypres, the battle for a small town that was crucial to logistics and control of the Channel in Belgium. The battle involved over 1 million men from both sides, and typical of World War I battled, neither was little regained, and both sides suffered horrific amounts of casualties. Next comes the Battle of Verdun, the single longest conflict of World War I. The Germans launched an offensive to try and take the ancient fortress town of Verdun, but the French held strong, dealing massive casualties to the German. The battle lasted from February to December of 1916, and over 600,000 men that took part in the battle were left as casualties. This was, unfortunately, fairly typical of World War I and trench warfare. Attacking was far too costly for the benefit, usually a couple of yards of land. But commanders had to set off on offensives and doom scores of young men to death. 1916 was an eventful year of battles, coming to the next one in Ottoman Turkey with the Battle of Gallipoli. The British had the bright idea of trying a naval invasion of Turkey in order to take Constantinople and control the sea routes. Ultimately, this was a huge failure for the British, leading to 180,000 casualties, with 28,000 of those being Anzac troops, being Australian or New Zealanders. As seen again, any attack was suicidal at best. The defenders were dug in too well, and they unleashed one of the latest inventions of pre-World War I, the machine gun. Invented by Hiram Maxim in 1884, World War I saw the first widespread use of the gun. It was designed to fire a large number of bullets for an extended period of time, without much reloading time, and the trade-off was limited mobility. That being said, in the static battlefields of World War I, limited mobility didn't matter. You just set up the gun on a platform in the trench, and then each power adapted the Maxim to fit their needs, so troops getting mowed down whenever they went over the top is set up for a blood path. Sidebar over, time for the next battle after Gallipoli, which is one of the most bloodiest battles of World War I. The Battle of the Somme, another river in France. In this, the British tried to overrun German positions but were gunned down by scores of Germany's MG08s, the German adaptation of the Maxim gun. It was estimated that over 50,000 Brits were casualties on just the first day. Now this is some serious carnage, even by World War I standards. The battle also featured the first tanks of the war, the British Mark I. Tanks were introduced to break the stalemate of the Western Front and provide that breakthrough aspect that infantry lacked. But much like everything else in World War I, fighting offensively with tanks proved to be difficult. The tanks would get bogged down in mud, they'd have mechanical failures all the time, their guns wouldn't fire, so on and so forth, or they'd be penetrated by enemy fire because the armor wasn't so great. Coming back to the Somme, little progress was made in over the 5-month-long campaign, and over 1 million lives came out scathed. Backtracking by a month or two, it's important to mention that the only real naval battle of the war, the Battle of Jutland. The Royal Navy and the Kriegsmarine had been hesitant to use their expensive ships in combat in case they got sunk, so those big battleships, or dreadnoughts, that caused so much anguish pre-World War I looked like they were going to be a non-factor. Until 1916 and Jutland, which saw many of both sides' dreadnoughts go down in flames. But it was a British victory when it was all said and done, and they were able to hold the North Sea blockade against the Germans and prevented them from importing any food or munitions from anywhere else. Moving on to 1917, we go back to Ypres for the Third Battle of Ypres, or the Battle of, this is going to be hard to pronounce, Passchendaele, from late July to early November 1917. This battle, much like all of the others, resulted in very little ground gained or lost, with both sides losing a combined 550,000 casualties. Moving on to a battle that was lightning paced by World War I standards was the Battle of Vimy Ridge in April of 1917, in which the Canadians attacked and gained their objective quickly and didn't sustain major losses. Next to 1918 and back to the Somme, in which the Germans finally punched through using a combination of mustard gas and artillery. They scored a breakthrough, but that victory was short-lived. With situations at home rapidly deteriorating and the Entente's strength greatly buffed by the entrance of the Americans in April of 1917, it looked like the stalemate of the Western Front would finally be broken. The series of battles that broke Germany was known as the 100 Days Offensive, beginning in August with the Battle of Amiens, with the Allies securing a good amount of land in 3 days. The battles of Meuse-Argonne, Cambrai, and Mons followed, all Allied victories and dealing massive blows to the German war effort. The writing on the walls was there for the Kaiser, and the armistice that ended the First World War was signed on the 11th of November at 11 hour 1918. 8.5 million men came out either war-scarred or dead, with an untold amount of families and communities affected. Moving on to the Eastern Front, there weren't too many major battles, but this front will segue nicely into the Russian Revolution of 1917. One of the biggest battles of the Eastern Front happened fairly early in the war, at Tannenberg. The Germans were losing initially, but after intercepting radio transmissions from the Russians, they were able to turn the tide and chase the Russians back into Russia, taking 90,000 prisoners. That was sort of the first of two major offensives in the Eastern Front, the second one being the Brusilov offensive, which was conducted into Austria-Hungary, but after things starting off really, really well for the Russians, they ran out of steam and supplies and had to retreat back to their original lines. So with those being the two major battles of the Eastern Front, I can move on to the Russian Revolution and discuss the causes and effects from it. Russia had been a poor country for a long time, and I mean a long time. The country had a massive peasant and poor population thanks to serfdom only being abolished there in 1861, centuries after the rest of Europe. This led to a large and generally illiterate and poor peasant population, and those problems were further exacerbated by Russia's late industrialization relative to the rest of Europe. During the period of industrialization, serfs and feudal peasants were given the right to organize, and they could, voice their discontent with the Tsar. Back to the bad stuff that happened pre-revolution. The influx of poor peasants into the cities for factory work created overcrowding and, to put it lightly, really, really bad living conditions for urban laborers. In fact, in a 20-year period, the populations of St. Petersburg or Leningrad or Petrograd and Moscow nearly doubled. That's an insane population growth in such a short period of time, especially by the late 19th century standards. A population boom at famines at the end of the 19th century caused frequent food shortages throughout the country, obviously. This all came to a head in 1905 when hundreds of unarmed protesters were shot by the army, prompting the event to be named Bloody Sunday. Strikes were held throughout the country, and Tsar Nicholas II responded by creating Dumas, not the writer, Dumas, in order to promote reform. These were ineffective, as the Tsar didn't really like any challenges to his rule, as an absolutist ruler would attest to. Fast forward to World War I, and Russia joined on the side of the Entente to help their French allies and to protect their Slavic brothers in Serbia. The war did not go well for Russia, to say the least. They were beaten heavily at the onset of the war in Tannenberg and were unable to do any real damage to the German army, despite outnumbering them in the field and Germany focusing on the west. Supply issues plagued the Russian army, and combined with ineffective leadership, save for a few generals, they were unable to use their large manpower to their advantage. Although saying this, the Russians did have one capable commander that orchestrated one good push. The aptly named Brusilov offensive, also called the June offensive, took place in 1916. The Russians smashed the Austrian front, breaking the lines in one day, in part because of Austrian ignorance and in another part because of the preparation and secrecy taken by Brusilov before the offensive. The result was positive, but pyrrhic in the sense that the Russians suffered heavy casualties and exhausted an already weak supply system. The Austro-Hungarians never did recover from the attack, though, and Germany had to divert troops from the west to stabilize the front, which helped the rest of the Entente. The offensive ended in September, but not before 2.5 million men were either killed or wounded, a brutal total. Nicholas actually left Petrograd to come lead the front in 1915 and left control of Russia to his German Tsarina, who began firing people left, right, and center. At the same time, an advisor by the name of Rasputin began increasing his influence over the Tsarina and the court. Rasputin was ultimately killed in 1916, but by then, the damage to the Russian people had been done. Facing economic instability, a losing war, and no trust in the leadership, the Russian people called for revolution. So in February 1918, or March 8th, 1917 on the Gregorian calendar, the first part of the broader revolution commenced. The troops of the Petrograd garrison was called to get rid of the revolution, but even as protesters were killed, they did not disperse, and the troop presence began to waver. The next day, the Duma established the provincial government with Alexander Kerensky at the head of it, and Tsar Nicholas II abdicated the throne, marking the end of the Romanov rule in Russia and the first empire to fall because of World War I. Back to Kerensky, he established popular reforms such as freedom of speech, equality before the law, and the right of unions to organize. But he kept Russia in the war, and that was deeply unpopular among the people, coupled with a worsening food shortage, and Russia didn't really improve following the February/March Revolution. Moving on to the more well-known revolution, the October Revolution, it's important to talk about Vladimir Lenin. He was living in Switzerland at the outbreak of World War I, and was actually taken by the Kaiser to Russia in order to cause havoc in Russia. And havoc he caused. He was an outspoken critic of the provincial government and immediately began plotting to overthrow the government. To him, the new government was nothing better than the Tsar because the government was still run by the bourgeois, or the wealthy. The ideal society was run by the peasants and the workers, which is a bit rich considering he was a part of the middle class growing up and he had the opportunity to attend law school, but move. As 1917 drew on, Russia became more war-weary and demanded change, so Lenin seized the opportunity and launched a bloodless coup d'etat against the provincial government, and Lenin set up the first Soviet government, or council, hence the Soviet Union, or a collective of councils. Lenin and his Bolsheviks secured Petrograd, and like that, Russia had become the first communist state. One of the first things that Lenin did was to get Russia out of World War I by signing the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, in which Russia gave up a lot of valuable land in the west, including the so-called breadbasket of the empire in Ukraine, along with Georgia, Finland, Poland, the Baltics, and land in Turkey. The conditions were harsh, but the important thing was that Russia was out of the war and could focus internally. With all of that land gone, matters were made worse by the Russian Civil War, in which Lenin's Bolsheviks fought just about every other faction in Russia, including the monarchists, capitalists, and other milder socialists like the Mensheviks. The war lasted about 3 years and cost about 12 million people, that's not a typo, in casualties. The majority civilian because of attacks, famine, and disease. So after all this, Russia had a new government in the Bolsheviks, and much rebuilding had to be done in Russia/the Soviet Union. To end the episode, I'll talk about the various treaties that affected the losing powers of World War I and the ramifications of such treaties. The largest and most well-known treaty was the Treaty of Versailles, signed June 28, 1919. Important to note that I didn't mention preceding this was there was a Paris Peace Conference presided by the four major powers that won: Britain, France, the US, and Italy. Japan was invited, but they didn't play a huge role in the proceedings. The conference decided that a League of Nations was needed to safeguard against any future war. Spoiler alert, it didn't. The conference was used to draft and ratify the various treaties that ended World War I. Back to the said treaties. Versailles placed the blame of the war on Germany. Germany had to pay crippling war reparations to the Entente, which caused hyperinflation in Germany that could have also led to the Great Depression having a greater impact on Europe, but that's for next episode. Germany also lost some territory, namely Alsace-Lorraine, which was returned to French hands after the Franco-Prussian War, and the Danzig Corridor, which was given to the newly formed Poland, who also gained territory from the Russians following their revolution. Moving on to the other major treaty of Saint-Germain and Laye, divided up the fractured Austro-Hungarian Empire. Austria and Hungary were given their more or less modern borders, while the treaty established Czechoslovakia and Yugoslavia. Austria went from ruling over one of the most powerful empires in all of Europe to essentially being banished to the Alps. The treaty also ceded the territories of Transylvania and Bessarabia, the first of which would be in contention with the Hungarians due to the large number of ethnic Hungarians living there, and the second, a source of loss for the Russians. The Treaty of Neuilly saw Bulgaria cede land to Yugoslavia, and the Treaty of Trianon took away 2/3 of Hungarian land pre-war. The Treaty of Sèvres dissolved the Ottoman Empire and led to the Turkish War of Independence, which ended with the Treaty of Lausanne in 1923. The French and British divided up the Arab territories by the Sykes-Picot Agreement, which were held by the Ottomans, the French taking Lebanon and Syria, and the British with Palestine and Mesopotamia. The First World War saw the death of 4 mighty empires, killed or wounded 41 million people, but the most horrifying thing that this wasn't the most horrific event to fell Europe in the first half of the 20th century. The war to end all wars was a lie, and in the next episode, I'll discuss the build-up, causes, battles, and aftermath of World War II. Thank you for watching, and see you in the next episode.